pour la deuxième partie de
We're
l'activité.
back now for the second part of this workshop. We'll have two presentations, one right after the other. So we shall wait for the round table to ask questions. For the first presentation, we have Ben Whalen of the Kennebecasis Watershed Restoration Committee. He will talk about his experience with Willow. With willow cuttings. Whenever you're ready, Ben.
Perfect. Thanks very much, everybody, for inviting me to come out today. I got to be honest, it's going to be a tough act to follow after David and Gary, and my perspective is going to be a little bit different. I am presenting today restoring our riparian zone, so we are focused on mainly stream side plantings and that kind of thing, on how to do that, how to protect your investment a little bit, and why willows are that first line of defense. So hopefully you can see my screen okay, and just to right off the get-go, I want to put out a bit of a disclaimer. I am talking from New Brunswick and a New Brunswick perspective. So therefore, sometimes I'm going to refer to some regulations and stuff like that. That is only in New Brunswick. So if you're listening to us from outside of New Brunswick, please be aware of the regulations within your own jurisdiction and update yourself on those rules that might apply to you. The other thing is this is an Indigenous plant workshop, and while I fully support planting Indigenous or native species, sometimes willow are very difficult to tell apart. And some of the pictures that you're going to see within our work here, you're going to see a non-native willow, but all of the willow that we are using within the Kennebecasis watershed and our riparian restoration efforts have been harvested from historical willow stands that existed along our waterway. So it was something that, you know, we harvested using volunteer effort. So sometimes the identification isn't always 100%. And therefore now we are always going back and taking from those same willow stands over and over again. And you'll see that in a little bit. So a disclaimer that not everything is native that you might see here in some of the photos. So I want to talk a little bit about the different tasks, and I've kind of broke it down to keep it within my 10-minute time frame here to 5 quick, simple tasks. Identify the healthy willow stands, identify landowners, both where you're going to harvest from and where you might plant from, harvest and store willow stock, how to do that really quickly, and then prepare and refresh the willow before you start to prepare or before you go and strike or stake the willow for the future. So task 1 is identifying healthy willow stands. If you're a watershed group or a community organization that you're looking to do some willow harvesting, one of the things that we've done in the past is actually go out and assess all of our willow stands up and down our waterway. And there were a number of things that we learned by going through that process. First, how to properly do that. And it's not rocket science. It can be very complicated if you want it to be, but we try to keep our overall assessment simple. You got to know, what are you going to be using the willows for? Strikes, stakes, or whips are terms that we use. A strike is basically something that will strike into a jiffy pot and will grow it to a seedling. A stake is something that we're going to directly stake after soaking and preparing it. We're going to stake it into the ground and let it propagate from a stake. And whips are something that we'll use for like brush mats or something like that. And you'll see some examples, hopefully, in a couple of other pictures here in a little bit. And if you're going to harvest, you need to know how much willow you're going to harvest. You know, do you need 5,000 stakes? Do you need 5,000 strikes? It's all very different. So when you assess your willow stands, you'll want to consider that. Also, you'll need to understand, are there invasive species to consider in the stand that you're harvesting from or potentially harvesting from? If there are, you want to take precautions not to take those invasive species somewhere else or where you are going to be staking or using that willow stock later on. Can the stand handle being cut back? How many trees are there? Is it a healthy stand? Is it heavily ice inundated? In other words, in the fall of the year, in the spring of the year, does it get beat up heavily with ice? That kind of thing. If there is ice, you'll want to kind of resist the urge to go in and harvest a whole bunch off of there, because it's going to need that thick stock on that first site to combat ice and scour from that site. The next thing is, and probably maybe one of the most important aspects that you consider in your assessment, is how accessible is the stand? One of the advantages of using willow staking in some of our efforts is we use volunteers to do a lot of the work, the harvesting and that kind of thing, which helps us as a nonprofit leverage some of that in-kind value for future funding. But if we have to walk volunteers 2 kilometers down a riverbank somewhere to get to a willow stand, and then walk back with a whole bunch of willow bundles over our shoulders and stuff, they'll never volunteer for me again. So we try to make sure that the stand is fairly accessible. Task 2, identify landowners. This is probably one of the key things that you have to do as the organizing organization that's going to go in and harvest willow or even plant the willow. Harvest site, you need to know who owns the property. You can do that through GOMB or any of those GIS databases that you might have access to. It's fairly simple. If you have a Department of Agriculture contact, like we do, we can get that information on who owns the property and then make a cold call to the property owner. We've got enough history for us now that we actually, most of the sites that we go and harvest from are sites that we established. So we already know who the landowners are, and it's become a cyclical thing. And I'll show you that diagram here in a little bit as well. But it's important to talk to the landowners where you're going to go harvest your willow from, and make sure that they're okay with you accessing the site using trucks, possibly along a waterway or something like that, or parked in their driveway for a short period of time. And you want to make sure that they're okay with you harvesting off that willow. Educate yourself as to the impacts harvesting willow has, and then make sure that you educate the landowner as well. Like, let them know that just because you're cutting these willow doesn't mean you're going to destroy them. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be healthy in the future, that you're going to do your due diligence and make sure that the stand remains healthy moving forward. At the planting site, you'll also need landowner permission. And what we do there is we do a restoration site plan. So we visit the landowner, we'll do a restoration site plan. We'll also ask questions around his infrastructure. Does he have water and sewer on site somewhere? Does he have, if he's a farmer, does he have drainage tile? If so, we don't plant willow near any of that drainage or any of that infrastructure because of the risk of possible root clogging of any pipes, intake or outtake pipes for water. So we make sure that we have a really firm conversation with the landowners on that. The other thing that you might want to introduce the landowner to is bees. Willow are very popular when it comes to pollinators, including bees and that kind of thing. I've been stung before going into a harvest site. So if you're going to go in and plant a bunch of willow and the landowner doesn't want a bunch of bees, or maybe he wants bees, inform him of that. There's a great opportunity for an increase in pollinators, but there's also a risk of getting stung. So if he has allergies or anything like that, he may not want to see you plant a bunch of willow there, or anything for that matter. We don't run into that too often, but it is an important conversation to have just for liability purposes. Task 3, harvest and store willow stock. We harvest during colder weather, March, early April. We can vary this a little bit. If we're using stakes, for instance, we can actually harvest stakes clean throughout the season, provided we harvest, or pardon me, provided that we soak those stakes for 48 hours. So if we soak those stakes and then drop them into our planting medium, if we're, again, that's usually just natural ground or natural soil somewhere. If we're doing that, we can soak them 48 hours from the time of harvest till when we're ready to use them, and they're good to go. If we're doing strikes, in other words, we're propagating them to seedling, we like to have them in the cold before they start to grow. So we harvest those usually March, early April. We take them to our nursery. We'll strike them into a planting medium, usually in early May. And then they're usually ready by mid-June for planting along our wetter riparian zones. If you're doing this, make sure that you're using sharp equipment. Sharp shears is important. A clean cut improves your overall performance of the willow. If you have a clunky knife or a dull pair of shears that are leaving bark scars and stuff like that on your stock, you're going to have more instance of die off, or you're not going to have as good of strike or a stake success as well. It tends to lead to a little bit of problems. Yeah, got it. Volunteers are important. You can get volunteers that way. iNaturalist on site is an important way to do. So when you're on the site, you can actually move through iNaturalist or have your volunteers use iNaturalist. And for your harvest, you don't need a WAWA permit. Storing, if you're storing them below freezing, as I said, you need to keep them dry. You can store them in longer lengths and freshen them off into shorter lengths. You'll require some freezer space. We have a freezer here that we keep ours in, but you can count your bundles as well. So keep them counted so that as an organization, you can then have a better idea of how many you put into the ground, which that's really, it's easier to count them when they're in those bundles and nice little organized bundles, as opposed to once you get them out in the ground, you try to go back and count each one you planted. That is a difficult task. Task 4 is the strikes and stakes again. So what you see in the picture is a number of strikes at a nursery. You need some pre-planning to do that. You have to have a conversation with a greenhouse locally, but you can do volunteers to do it. You can grow a large number that way, but you require a lot of space. It does cost a little bit of money. We basically we've worked out an agreement with some of our local nurseries where they provide the space, we provide the jiffy pots and all the materials they need, but they also provide some of the watering and stuff like that at no cost to us. So it can be, now I have that relationship, not everybody's gonna have that. Stakes, they require less planning, they're harder to store, they are less successful. So we get about a 65 to 72% success rate on our strikes. We only get about a 60 to 65% success rate on our stakes. You can still use volunteers, you can plant a large number still, and they do cost a little less overall. Here's a cyclical aspect of it, and you'll see some pictures here. In the left-hand side, we have a volunteer cutting some of this willow stalk. In the bottom, they're striking them as a willow to go to the nursery. Then you take the stalk out to your site and you can either plant it or prepare it for being used as a brush mat, which is what you see in the top right corner. And then over time, you'll see what you see in the center top is a healthy riparian zone. So willow first line of defense. The reason why they're a great line of defense is they have a high root mass that helps resist erosion, helps keep soils back along an eroding stream bank. They grow quickly, so they can make a very quick impression on your before and after photos. And for funders that might tour the site, they're very resilient. They can get knocked down by ice and then they will come back up rather quickly. They act as guards to the upland. So that thick growth of willow that you see can actually provide protection for the species that you might get from Dawn or other nurseries around. And so therefore, you protect that investment, that more expensive investment of, you know, your butternut, your bur oak, your swamp oak, your hemlock, your cedar. So you're protecting that. It also provides a wide range of habitat. Willow provide a huge amount of bird habitat, a huge amount of pollinator habitat, great corridor protection and hiding spaces for small terrestrial animals as well. So it's great that way. And then I can go on and on about the protection it provides to rivers and streams. So it's important for us to take sites that look like what you see in the top left. And again, the pictures are a bit grainy because they come off of an old document that we have. So the picture that you see on the left is a degraded riparian zone. 10 years later, after doing some riparian zone planting and willow planting, you see the picture that's there on the right. So thank you very much. I wish I had a little bit more time to go a little bit more detail on that, but it is what it is. And the WAWA permitting process is one thing that you should consider as well. So I did have on there a slide that had WAWA. To plant the trees, you need a WAWA. To harvest willow stakes, you don't need a WAWA, which is a bit ironic, but it is the case. And thank you very much. And I'll share my screen.
Thank you again. Thank you, Ben. Sorry, I don't like to be the one that tells
No,
people
that's
like
fair. You gave me,
but
you
you
gave
did
me
an
a funny
awesome
then.
job. You did an awesome job. Thank you so much. So we'll move things along with Claire. Yeah, great.
Perfect. Can everyone hear me? Great. So thanks for handing it off, Ben. And I'm finishing up our presentations for the day, but certainly we've had some great ones so far. So just to start, my name is Claire Ferguson, and I work with the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. And today I'm going to be talking about invasive species and how you can be plant-wise this upcoming year. So before I get into talking about the details, I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization. So we are a nonprofit based out of Fredericton, New Brunswick, although we travel across the province. And we are guided by a steering committee that has various different inputs and outlooks that are represented from across the province. And we are a chapter of the National Canadian Council on Invasive Species. So our mission as an organization is to protect New Brunswick's environmental, economic, and recreational interests from the threat of invasive species. So the main three areas that we work with are education and awareness, so doing presentations like this. We also help to facilitate collaboration amongst many different partners to help improve management of invasive species. And we also work to provide knowledge to our various partners and groups across the province so that they don't have to go through that journey themselves. So to get everyone on the same page, you may ask, what are invasive species? So when we talk about invasive species, for us, a species has to meet these 3 criteria to be considered invasive. So the first one is that it is non-native. So that means it is not something that is originally from our area. So it could be that it is native to a completely different other continent, or even it's native to another part of Canada as well. The second factor is that it spreads very rapidly. So it's a species that if it is introduced to a new area, it will either, if it's an animal, have many, many offspring, or in our case today, if it's a plant, that means that the plants will grow and spread very rapidly and could take over a natural area. And the third factor is that it is harmful in some way. So it could be that it is harmful to our environment, to our ecosystems, but this could also mean that it is harmful to various recreational activities or even to human health. So for something to round that up, for something to be considered an invasive species, it has to be non-native, spread rapidly, and harmful. So I did want to clarify before going ahead that not all non-native species are invasive. So an example of this would be the common tomato plants that many of us have in our gardens. So oftentimes those are not a native species. However, as many of us have experienced, you need to give lots of care to tomato plants, and if left to their own devices, they wouldn't take over a natural area. So this is a distinguishing factor. If something, a plant or another species meets all these 3 criteria, then we would consider them to be invasive. Now, there are many different impacts that invasive species can have. So focusing more so on the plant and gardening aspects today, it would be species that would compete with our native plant species for space or food. So this example here is garlic mustard, which is commonly found in areas across the province. And as you can see in the photo, it has completely taken over that forest floor. So there have been very few other native species in there. Once an invasive species is also brought into an area, if it takes over and only leaves small section of native plants, then that means our native wildlife species will be predating and eating more of those native species that we have, which would reduce those populations. And now to jump into the more socioeconomic and health-related aspects, they can have impacts to human health. So this example that is on the screen is of giant hogweed, which is found in a few spots throughout the province. And this is certainly a plant that if you do not want to come into contact with, but if you do, you have to be very cautious where the sap, if it interacts with the sunlight, can actually cause very serious burns. And to move ahead, invasive plants can also impact different infrastructure. So this example here is Japanese knotweed, another very common plant found in the province, but the rooting system is so strong with this plant that it can actually break through concrete. So you can only imagine the risks that it would pose if it's found near a foundation or sidewalks. And also when we do have invasive plants that are introduced to some of our sensitive habitats, such as wetland and riparian areas, they can also alter how those ecosystems function. And so they may not function as well as they would if only native species were found there. So the question that many would ask is, why can't you just get rid of them? So there are many different issues that we face when either trying to remove an invasive or to eradicate and control it. Oftentimes, these activities are very, very labor intensive, they're very time consuming, costly, and unfortunately can be minimally effective. So what we are trying to do as an organization is to teach people how to prevent these introductions from happening in the first place, to prevent them from spreading further. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a brand new program that we are rolling out in New Brunswick, which is the PlantWise program. So this is a national program that is seen across the country that supports first the ornamental horticultural industry's transition to become invasive free. And it's also to try and help gardeners and different industry members understand which plants are invasive and how they can harm our communities, as well as then making plant-wise choices. So choices that would prevent these invasives from being introduced to your gardens. With this plant-wise program, we also have another program with it called Grow Me Instead, which is to let people know about various invasives and then provide native alternatives that can fill those gaps as well. And I did want to say, while this is a bit more focused on plants, the PlantWise program does also include other aspects of gardening, which would be soil, as well as pond and aquarium plants too, and xeriscapes, although it's not quite as common in our area. So here are a number of ways that you can be plant-wise. So the first and foremost one, which was mentioned by various other presenters today, is to select plants that are not only native to our region, but also ones that are going to successfully grow within your garden conditions. So make sure that you're choosing native plants that will grow well where you're trying to grow them. So if they need wetter and more moist soil conditions, make sure that's something that you're keeping an eye out for. We also want to encourage people to purchase locally grown or sourced plants and seed mixes, because most of the times your nurseries will have some native plant species available, but also make sure that they are properly labeled. And so when you're purchasing a plant, make sure the label does include the scientific name on that as well, so you can make sure you know what species you are buying. This is a big one for those looking at their gardens now, is be very wary of using wildflower or pollinator seed mixes, because often they are not specific to our area and can include invasives. So make sure to research what species are found in that mix. And if you find an invasive plant in your garden, make sure to dispose of that properly. So do not put any invasive plants in your compost, because that is how they can escape and go to different areas. So ideally, we recommend to put invasive plant materials and seeds into 1 or 2 garbage bags and then bring them to your local landfill so that they do not end up in your natural areas. A few other steps is to make sure to inspect your garden and the plants that you're buying for any unknown or unusual other hitchhikers. So this could be the plant themselves or other plant seeds that have been found in the pot. But this also could be insects, worms, and signs of disease. And finally, we want to encourage everyone to talk to your local botanical gardens, nurseries, garden centers, and gardening clubs, and to try to promote the selling of native plants and to make sure that they are including scientific names on their labels as well. So I won't go into these in detail, but here are just a few of the many gardening related invasive species that have been found in the province. The 3 up top, which are English ivy, Japanese barberry, and Oriental bittersweet, can be found in various nurseries and garden centers across the province. However, they are highly invasive. Japanese knotweed and Phragmites are ones that are not seen quite as often in our garden centers, but started off as horticultural plants and sometimes are currently being maintained. So these are ones that if you have it, you want to make sure to let us know that you have it, particularly with Phragmites, and to look into properly trying to remove the species so it does not spread further. And one that I also wanted to put on everyone's radar, which was discovered in the last year in New Brunswick, is jumping worms. So these are so although our earthworms are all non-native, these ones are particularly harmful to gardens and forested areas and have been found in potted plants and vermiculture and vermicompost. So this is certainly one to keep an eye out for. Now, as far as identifying and reporting invasive species, as for identification, we want to encourage everyone to learn how to identify invasive plant species. And once you do, try and keep an eye out for them. So I wanted to let everyone know today that currently we are working on a Grow Me Instead guide that is specific for New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, which is being done in partnership with the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council, the Harriet Irving Botanical Garden and Center at Acadia University. And we have received lots of different guidance and feedback from many nurseries across the 2 provinces, including some on this call today. So this will be a booklet that has over 50 invasive plants that are found throughout both of the provinces and many native alternatives. So this is a guide that is coming very soon, so keep an eye out for it. And I also did want to throw it out too, that for those that are associated with nurseries across New Brunswick, we are currently trying to gather more information on who is selling different native plant species and what their availability is, because we're hoping that as we continue to grow our PlantWise and Grow Me Instead guide, that we can share that information with the public that are looking for these invasives. So if you do have that information, you're selling native species, our program director, Kristen, is going to put that survey on the chat, and it would be great for you to reach out. We'd love to be in contact with you. And on the reporting side, if you do think that you have found an invasive plant or other species in your garden, please put those observations on either iNaturalist.ca or reach out to us directly to report them, because we are currently trying to gather more information about invasive species across the province. So I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to this presentation today. And if here's our website, email, and our social media if you want to reach out and learn more. And I'm happy to answer more questions about invasive species.
That's great. Thank you, Claire. Great presentation. So we'll